Welcome to another episode of the All Turtles podcast, a show about entrepreneurship and AI. I'm John Cifuentes, co-founder of All Turtles. Today, I'm interviewing Azeem Azhar, the founder and curator of the Exponential View newsletter and podcast, which is an incredible set of resources on the future of exponential technologies, like AI's application in genomic research or the ways companies should use these technologies. Then, Jessica Collier and Phil Libin joined me for an AI use case that we think might be creepy, but might be kind of okay. And we answer a listener question about federated learning systems. So we are very pleased to welcome Azeem Azhar, the founder and editor of Exponential View, which is an incredible newsletter and resource on AI. And he also hosts a podcast of the same name, where he covers exponential technologies and their effects on business and society. Azeem has previously founded an early machine learning company called Peer Index, which was acquired by Brandwatch. And you've invested in startups. You were a journalist at The Guardian and The Economist. And Azeem, am I leaving anything out?
No, I've had a career full of job changes because I try to move before anyone finds me out.
So what inspired you to start Exponential View? Because obviously the world needs more email and newsletters.
Well, that's very true. It started after my company Peer Index was acquired, and I had spent 7 years really as the founder focusing on making that business a success and serving customers and making sure that the team was growing and getting what it needed. And I hadn't really picked my head up from that entrepreneur's laser focus. I mean, I had given up my board seats and my advisory roles in order to start that company. And so once the acquisition came in, I could take a breath, and I realized lots of other things had moved on. And I thought the best way to keep up with these changes was to start to read about them. And the best way to do that consistently was to make a public commitment to taking some notes and sharing that with some friends, which is why I started the newsletter. And I emailed 20 friends initially back in March 2015.
Now, you said in 2016 that our AI future is inevitable. And here we are 3 years later. Would you say that we've successfully arrived at that future, or are we still working towards something that you had envisioned?
You know, we're arriving towards it, and I think the future in of itself will take the decades to get to a point of stability. We're at the beginning of a very unsettling, choppy period. What has happened in the last 3 years has been absolutely incredible. And I think if I had gone back and looked at some of my predictions back in 2016, I would have been very surprised in general at just how much investment has gone in, how much research has occurred, how many breakthroughs we've had, and equally surprised about things that have ended up taking a little bit longer. So there's actually a mixed picture. There's also some divergence. There are companies, particularly startups, and particularly the native internet companies like Tencent or Google, who are able to take advantage of this very, very well. And there are traditional industries who are quite struggling about how they should make that switch. And then there are traditional organizations and institutions like governments who are starting to understand that this could make a big difference to the way they operate, but they haven't quite figured out what to do, and they haven't perhaps been able to get the talent either.
I think that's being kind. Woefully behind. Is this you mentioned the early internet companies as having this distinct advantage. Is this that idea of the AI lock-in loop that you've described in the past?
Yes, I called it the AI lock-in loop, and then a different phrase took over, which was the data network effect. And for about 2 years, I fought the corner of the lock-in loop, and now I've just given up and said it's going to be the data network effect. So they're the same thing. They're this idea that if you're a product company, if you put machine learning into your product, it should improve the product. If that product improves, more people will use it. If more people use it, you will get more data from the product, and particularly data in odd use cases and edge cases. And that data will improve the machine learning, making the product better. And that loop will accelerate, and you'll get these increasing returns to scale. And traditionally in industrial economics, you get decreasing returns to scale. You'll get these increasing returns to scale, and then it becomes very, very hard for companies to come in and challenge you on your native terrain. And I think that's very much what we've seen with Netflix and with Google and Facebook and many of the others.
Although I think we're in an interesting time for Netflix in particular. I saw that Disney's pulling all of their content in just some short months now and launching their own web service.
Well, so there we have a challenge of two different aphorisms, don't we? Because on the one hand, we've got content is king versus data network effects.
Right.
And which of those sort of blithe conference titles will win that battle? I mean, who's to say?
I think I'd fall asleep at that panel.
Yeah, that's right. Another content is king panel.
You've I've been listening to your podcast for a long time and actually subscribed to the newsletter for a long time, and
thank you.
made my team here do the same. And you've credited the role of exponentially improving technologies like hardware, like GPUs, and as these forces that, all this investment that's come in on the hardware side that's allowed AI to develop so quickly. But could we maybe spend some time on the kinds of technologies that you think will improve, maybe not the technologies themselves, but what are the really big problems that you're seeing AI applied to in exponentially great sort of ways?
Oh, I mean, it's just so remarkable. As a general purpose technology, the way that I think of AI is that it is a binding glue. It is a thing that is common between and across other breakthrough technologies like gene sequencing or lithium-ion batteries or robotics. I mean, it's a thing that they all have in common. But I'll give you a couple of really interesting examples. So one is in the area of gene sequencing. So I just spoke recently with an entrepreneur and academic called Stephen Hsu, whose company Genomic Prediction can look at gene sequences taken from very early embryos that are going through an IVF pipeline, and with pretty good results predict the likelihood that these embryos will develop severe disease conditions. And then as you walk your way through the IVF process, you can choose the embryos that are most viable and least likely to have these very difficult long-term health complications as they turn into fetuses and then ultimately into babies. So that's a really powerful example. And I think we're starting to see really interesting examples in those fields that were computationally quite hard for us to address. So things like protein discovery and biochemistry and chemistry, where the degrees of freedom were so large that traditional humans kind of had to hand tool their way through this and use their intuition. And you can now start to throw some smart maths or AI or machine learning at it to try to make some breakthroughs. And that's where we start to see things that are orders of magnitude better than the past. In terms of the dollar impact right now, or the number of humans those sorts of breakthroughs are touching, it's not so large now, but I think the potential is very high.
Yeah, it's interesting. I want to talk a little bit about both of those examples. One, the real world Gattaca example. Right. I don't know if everyone remembers this movie. Very great Ethan Hawke movie. Just opening up all kinds of ethical considerations on. It's curious to me how that startup even came to be and who's supporting them and what they're able to do outside of just like a research phase.
It is super interesting. And I think what it does is shows the kind of ethical challenges that we will deal with, but also how they unfold. And ethical challenges of this nature don't turn up like a self-driving car in the trolley problem that decides to hit you. It doesn't just appear out of nowhere and kind of run into you. They emerge over time. They're often thought through quite far in advance by ethicists, and in particular with this genomic prediction company. It built on top of some quite accepted practice within the IVF world. One of those practices is that you end up with a number of eggs being fertilized in every IVF cycle, and you increasingly test those fertilized eggs for what's known as aneuploidy. We'd call it Down syndrome, so a chromosomal abnormality. And then you choose to implant the one that doesn't have the abnormality. And that was a very simple test that didn't use any machine learning or AI. And so it's only a single step to then go off and say, hey, we can now, at very low cost, do a kind of genomic read of those same cells and help you understand the risk of this particular fertilized egg developing further down at some point during the life, developing cystic fibrosis or some other very difficult medical condition. And once you know that, you can decide which of the 5 or 6 you choose to take viable, because you'll normally only work with one. And so I think the reason that's interesting is because it's not like it's a switch. Like one day we couldn't do this and the next day we could. It was these issues slowly emerge, creepingly. You can see them in the distance in kind of contours of grey approaching you. As they approach you, they start to sharpen in terms of what we can see of them. And that means that we can and we are having conversations about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. Very interesting about genomic prediction. They're not actually editing any genes. They're not editing any humans in any sense.
So we
They're
can't
sort
say
of helping in our selection
eyes,
process.
6'3".
Yeah, well, that would just, if anyone's worked with software engineers before, you always know that the first few versions don't come out as you planned. So right. I wouldn't want to be the first person doing that.
What do you see are some of the clear or obvious limitations in AI, or maybe some of the more subtle limitations?
Well, I think our imagination has been taken over by science fiction in terms of thinking about what AI is and isn't. At the end of the day, we can look at what we have practically in front of us, and you're absolutely right, identifying things that we've been able to characterize as problem sets. We have a way of driving engineering systems such as AI to solve them. Things that we can't characterize particularly well, we then need to gather lots of data in order to solve them. And there are things that where we actually can't characterize them well and we can't gather the data. And then in which case, how are we going to build whatever we want to build? And that's why my own view around this notion of a human-like artificial general intelligence is that I don't feel that we will get there in any way that has generally been dressed up in science fiction, whether it's C-3PO or the Terminator, because we don't have a good enough working model of what happens in our brains. I think the way that what we will get to instead will be remarkable extended intelligence, remarkable superpowers, things that simply do things that humans can't even conceive of doing. And that latter category of superpowers we're already starting to see in the market today, in industry, and applied. And I think this relentless focus on, can we create some kind of bipedal walking robot that can take the place of Nanny? Just my own understanding of how industrial breakthroughs have happened and how research works says I'm just not sure we'll ever get there.
You talk to a lot of large companies about their readiness for this type of integration in their systems. Are companies or industries adequately prepared for some of the more industrial tasks that AI is doing obviously much better than a human could?
I think companies have 3 big problems on their hand. The first problem is they have a business model issue, which is that many AI-based businesses have very different business models to incumbents. The second issue they have is they have really, really deep technology debt because their systems have been built over the last 15 to 20 years or even longer. And the third issue they have is one about people and organization, which is really hard to find the talent, and it's really hard to reorient the internal structure of your company in order to make use of that talent in the right way. So I am not sure that very many of our traditional industrial firms will be able to make the leap in the same way that when we saw the introduction of the automobile and electricity and the telephone and the airline, not many steamship companies became successful airline operators. Now, I think what will happen is that many of them will be able to transition, and the very best, those who invested heavily in cloud computing and in more dynamic management structures, will be able to make the change. I'm sure the companies, the incumbents who work with all turtle startup studios will probably do better than the ones who won't.
You know, I wonder, looking at this word techlash and wondering, I'm on the side of the camp where this is a slower process than the media articulates, that, you know, whole industries aren't suddenly wiped away from the face of the earth, that even older generations of people can subtly retrain skills to maintain their usefulness as these companies really struggle to remake themselves kind of in the face of AI. You know, certain jobs will, you know, certainly cease to exist in a small number of years, but could it lead to a sort of, and this may be, you know, coming from you know, now many years in San Francisco and kind of the hub of a lot of this technology. Could you see this leading to a sort of techlash, like a Luddite revolution? Will we all, you know, be artisanal cheesemakers and carpenters and you know, designers?
There's a lot in that question, and the techlash that we currently see today is about a number of things that are very kind of proximate, and those things I think really relate to a large part sort of Facebook's you know, use as a useful idiot in political manipulation and what's happening on the surface with privacy, and the fact that these things have not been well handled by the tech companies, and the fact that the tech companies for many years went off and cavorted saying, listen, we're neutral platforms, we don't take any position, when of course as soon as you analyze them, they naturally take a position, because just to be in the market, you're taking a political position. So I think that's the cause of quite a lot of the frustration. What we have historically seen at times of these transitions is a hell of a lot of uncertainty. I mean, the world that you and I live in was designed and built on the basis of three key bits of technology, which was the phone, electricity, and the car, and the oil age as underpinning all of that. And those all came about in the late 1890s. By the time we hit a period of stability, for that, we had gone through World War I, a deglobalization that led to World War I and saber rattling, the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, and World War II, before we got to our golden age in certainly the United States and Western Europe, where we all got our second car and our picket fence and our fridge and TV. And it took a 50-year period. And during that period, you know, trades unions emerged with greater strength, and there were more worker rights, and we had, the national health system in the UK service and so on. It takes a really long time, and it's really uncomfortable going through that process. And I think we're likely to be going through a similar process, but it's much more complicated because the world is bigger and it's more interconnected. It's going to happen at different paces in different parts of the world because people have different attitudes. If you look at consumers, citizens in China and Singapore, they're still relatively optimistic about the value that the big tech platforms bring to their lives. If you look at consumers in the UK and the US, they are less optimistic, in 2018 than they were in 2016 about whether these platforms are positive in their lives. And then we've got this sort of whole spectre of climate change and demographic transition over the top. So this idea of the techlash against Facebook right now, which frankly, in my opinion, and if you read my newsletter, is richly deserved, is a really tiny pimple on what is going to be a really dramatic outburst of acne over the sort of face of 21st century humanity. Oh,
that's very visual and applies a new meaning to Facebook.
Can we just chat briefly about one company where I think they have done something really interesting around incentive design? So
yeah, please. Let's talk about an optimistic future for AI.
Yeah. Well, there's this insurance company called Lemonade, which is backed by Sequoia.
I love Lemonade.
Amongst others. You guys know it?
My quick Lemonade story is I woke up one day in my apartment to the building across the street completely engulfed in flames.
Right.
And I used Lemonade in about 60 seconds to insure my belongings.
Genius. Just-in-time insurance. So the interesting thing about Lemonade, all the AI brilliance and great UI and so on, is that they identified that in the insurance industry there is a bad incentive design between you, the person paying the premiums, and effectively the insurance carrier who has an incentive not to pay you out. And therefore you have an incentive to lie to them because you want to try and get your fair amount against someone who's going to try and shill you.
Right.
So what they did was they put a third party in the room, which is your favorite nonprofit, whether that's a climate change charity or an animal welfare charity or something else. And they cap their return at 25%, and any retained premia, they will then donate to your favorite charity. So you have every reason to be honest to them. They have every reason just to pay you out quickly, and the charity benefits. Now, the old 1980s Gordon Gekko school of capitalism says, I ain't touching anything that caps its upside. But of course, the upside for Lemonade is that this is a highly disaggregated market. They don't have to make money, they don't have to make extortionate money on every single relationship.
Right.
They can just have lots of happy retained customers and a decent market share and do super well.
Right, exactly. Azeem, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate bringing you on across the oceans. I'm surprised that this worked as well as it did. Thank you, Marie, for making it happen.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, John, and thank you, all turtles.
So now it's time for an AI use case. And Phil, I think you had one that you've been experiencing lately.
Yeah, we've talked about this family of use cases before, and sometimes it works really well, and sometimes it doesn't, which is the auto-suggest stuff that you see in like iMessage. There's one that I noticed a while ago, which is if you, on an iPhone and iMessage, if you text someone, where you at, or where are you, or something like that, one of the options that the recipient gets in the auto-suggest is just plugging in your current calendar, your current location. And so if you say to somebody where you're at, they can just push a button and send you their location, which is kind of surprising and I think kind of cool, but I don't know. I'm not sure. There's another one that I just saw, I just remembered about today because it just came up today, but I remember seeing it before and thinking that this one is actually really good, which is if you're like signing up for a website or, logging in or something, you've got two-factor authentication turned on where, they have to text you a code and you're on the phone, you can have the web page in your browser on your phone feel or like hear the, the ding that the text came in. And then when you put the cursor, when you tap into the field to type in the text, it automatically lets you push a button in auto-suggest and types in the code for you. Like figures out that the text that you just received is a code for this website and like lets you type it in. So I think autocorrect is like, it's getting pretty smart, but I think it's mostly a good thing, but I'm not exactly sure when it is and when it isn't.
Hey, maybe the jarring part is like you're being shown explicitly what you're giving up in terms of your data, whereas a lot of systems that you're currently interacting with have your location and it doesn't really matter because it's just kind of implicit. But here's like a extremely explicit way of putting yourself on display and saying, here, friend, here I am.
Or like allowing your machine to read all of your messages.
Which it does all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And scrape data from them and then use it to do something semi-useful.
Right. Save you from typing in a 6-digit code.
For 2 seconds, yeah.
And that code is actually, I think that's actually pretty cool because otherwise you have to go back and forth and remember it or cut and paste, which is kind of awkward on a phone. And, the code is only good for a few seconds anyway, or I don't know for how long. So it's not like your password, but it feels a little bit weird, right? It's like as if the machine is telling you oh yeah, here's your password, type it in. And you'd be like, well, that's not good. But of course, it's not your password. It's a PIN. It's a code, which is only a single use thing. So it's probably okay. But yeah, I think you're right. It does make you think about well, what else does this thing know about me? And the location one is interesting. Like I tried it with Jessica, and I think like, what was your experience with
it? My experience of it was that I was like, well, that's kind of cool. And I'm turning location services off immediately. So like it wasn't cool enough to make me feel like it was okay to just let the machine have all of this information.
A lot of my friends share their locations with their friend, like just kind of randomly. Like if you look at someone's list,
find my friend's thing.
It's just like a big list of random people who have constant access to your location.
Yeah, I turned all of that off like years ago just because I realized, there's like no good's going to come out of my alleged friends knowing where I am.
And yet there have been entire products built around like the apparently like, serendipitous experience of like finding other people in your city. Like that's what Foursquare was initially built on.
That's a lot of WeChat's functionality is based on that.
Yeah. So like there have been entire products that are based on this, which feels somehow more overt and less insidious than just your phone just like broadcasting to people where you are.
So I'm going to come down in these two particular autocomplete ones, the where you at and the PIN number. I think I'm going to say that these are good. Like when you really think about them, they don't violate any more privacy. If you've got location turned off, then like pushing that button just tells you, hey, your location's turned off. Do you want to turn it back on? So it kind of reminds you that that's a setting. It doesn't violate it automatically. And for the code, the autocomplete for the two-factor authentication code, like it's just a code. You're not actually giving up any security by having it do that. So I think for these two, it's for me, I can't think of any downsides. So I think it's a good example.
I think for me, the upsides are so minimal that like, who cares?
Well, like cutting and pasting on a phone is literally the hardest thing I do.
Don't you just use it as like a memory exercise? Like remember this like 6-digit code for 5 seconds.
It's like an alarm clock that you have to do some math before you can turn it off.
Like the upsides are so limited and like not very helpful or impactful.
Although, have you ever had just a back and forth conversation with autocomplete with someone? It can be really fun.
Oh, I've done entire
a significant
conversations just by that. Yeah, just pushing any of the 3 autocomplete buttons.
Right.
Yeah, there's whole like reams of like poetry that have been written that way.
I have so many problems with that because they don't like autocomplete does not like 50-cent words. I'm like, no, it's a word. I know that it's a word. It is a real word.
So I think our listeners should send us their best examples of autocomplete poetry or conversations. Maybe we could do a whole podcast where all we're doing is reading autocomplete stuff.
Yeah, that could be captivating. Cool. That's a good example.
Next time.
And now it's time for a listener question. And this one comes in from Niels via email. I think Niels has emailed us before. Thanks for the questions, Niels. So he asks, what do you think is the potential of federated learning systems? And for quick background, federated learning is a nascent technology that enables training of neural networks stored on the device. It'll never leave the device, doesn't need to go to the cloud. It just kind of stays there. What are the advantages?
I thought he was talking about the Federation learning systems, which I thought was some kind of like a Starfleet, Star Trek reference.
That would make more sense.
Which I was very excited about.
Yeah.
I think it's very high potential.
Yeah. On-device NLP is a little more
Fun
boring.
fact, I once wrote one chapter of an unfinished graphic novel on the concept of federated trust in decentralized systems. If anyone ever wants to see it.
I think we all do. I think we all definitely want to see it.
It has a lot of Star Trek references that I had to Google all of them because I've never watched Star Trek.
So what are federated learning system, John channeling Niels?
John channeling Niels? Well, he brings up a lot of good examples. Mm-hmm. He says that having this capability can conceivably allow us to answer questions like what behavioral patterns enhance or detract from my productivity. This means on the phone, just kind of constantly monitoring what you're doing, thinking, feeling, interacting with on the phone. Which days are you happiest? Which friends are you not keeping in touch with? How much money do you spend on stuff that you shouldn't be? What things make you feel unhappy? And he goes on to say that his personal belief is that giving people such objective use of this data has the potential to be extremely powerful in personal development.
I think with the actual technology advance, right, is that you can do a lot of this computation on the device itself, right? So you train the model, the AI model, it runs on the phone, and so the promise is that your data never actually leaves the device. It doesn't go to any kind of a cloud service where it might be used for for other things that you don't want it to be used for. You kind of keep control of it, but you still have this we still have this capability. So the individual devices that are close to the users are actually doing the computation, and then there's some kind of central service that puts this together in a way that theoretically protects privacy or actually protects privacy, but still gives you this like deep functionality of figuring stuff out. And so like, what kinds of things would you accept? How much would you want your device, your computer, your phone to know about you if you were fairly confident that that knowledge never actually left your phone, but it was really only for you? And with that, does that set the threshold differently than if you thought that, well, there's just some kind of a mothership in the cloud that's figuring all this stuff out and maybe knows stuff about you that it could use for other purposes?
I don't know if it matters. Like, you still have a bandwidth interface problem. You know, you're still interacting with the phone with your hands and your eyes. And like, I don't know if you could make use of, unless we are merged with our devices in a, you know, truly cyborg-like way. I don't see what recommendations I'd follow from my phone, paying attention to the ways in which I text whom, and like, I'm not going to change my behavior.
Oh, I disagree.
A graph
I think
says something.
I think what he's laying out here is the idea that like your mobile device could essentially become an AI, right? It's like an AI that you carry around with you, because most people interact with their phones like multiple hours a day, right? So your phone has more information about you than probably anything or anyone else on earth.
Sure.
And so if you kind of block it to that device, you could create what is essentially an external learning hard drive of yourself.
Yeah, but it wouldn't matter if I can't access it. Like, couldn't we do that now, just with some slight latency?
I think the difference is the privacy, kind of the threshold and the trade-off between privacy and functionality. Right. So the way that most kind of machine learning AI stuff that's done right now, where it's all your devices gather all this information about you, and then there's a bunch of servers that figure stuff out. That information is available to the servers, and you're just not exactly sure what it's going to be used for, or what it might be used for later, or who has access to it. And so you kind of worry about it. Just like in the conversation we were just having about the autocomplete. You know, if like your phone knows what your location is, what you're actually, the permission that you're setting is like, do you want to enable that phone to send that location, you know, up to the internet? So the question is, if you could do this in a federated way where all of the intelligence was on your phone and it never left your phone, would you just feel much more comfortable like giving it permission to know things about you that otherwise you'd probably be freaked out about? Or does it even matter? Because, you know, are people really going to like pay attention to like what's on your phone, what's on the network? And does it matter in real life very much?
Right. Can they? Like, do you have the capability to even pay attention to all that stuff at once?
Well, but how would you, I guess my question is like, this is a trust problem, right? And so users would have to trust that like what the phone was telling them, that it wasn't actually, that it was federated and this information wasn't going anywhere. They would have to believe that.
Right.
And how would they believe that? And like, how would you do those disclosures in a way that was actually sensible and people understood, well, this thing stays on the device, whereas this other thing goes up to the server, and what are they allowed to do with it? Like this sort of raises all the GDPR, all the data protection type disclosure problems, like another order of magnitude and complexity. And I just think, like, it only takes one or two times for that to be mislabeled or you know, violated in some way for trust to be destroyed in this whole thing. So I'm just not sure. Like, I think the technology is super interested from a privacy and trust perspective. I'm not sure that you're ever going to be able to get to the types of disclosures and transparency that'll make a difference in actual people's behavior.
Right.
But
yeah, and the thing that most people do to like make users trust that they're dealing with your data appropriately is to not store it. Right. And what he's actually suggesting is nothing but like infinite storage, but on a device that theoretically only you have access to.
Yeah. And theoretically could be encrypted so that no one else could access it. But this is interesting in this other way, which is a lot of these kinds of architectural technologies in the past were meant to optimize for some scarce resource, basically trading off CPU versus local memory versus network capacity versus like distributed CPU. So it was like a technical trade-off. It's like, well, what's cheaper, network or CPU? The more processing that you can do on the device, the more scalable it is, because then like everyone's got a device. So you've got, you know, hundreds of millions of these things. Whereas, you know, if you have to like push it up to a server, then there's a fewer number of servers. It's kind of more expensive. But then you have to trade that off with networking. How much information are you actually sending across? So if you do a lot of processing in the device, maybe the device is more expensive, but there's less networking that has to happen as opposed to like sending all of the raw data up to the network. And that trade-off kept shifting, right? With like every time there's like an advance in network speeds, like the networking became relatively cheaper than the CPU, but then like there would be like a big CPU upgrade, and then the CPU became cheaper than networking. So like the past 20 years, you've kind of had flip-flop in terms of what you're trying to optimize for. What is the scarce resource? Is the scarce resource memory? Is the scarce resource CPU processing? Or is the scarce resource network? But now what's happening is like, maybe the scarce resource is trust. Like it's a different kind of thing. It's a psychological resource of like, how much do people actually trust this thing? And it's interesting to see like if user trust actually becomes a scarce resource, then you have to balance between that and CPU and networking and other stuff. Like what kind of decisions will designers make?
Yeah, that is actually super interesting. Plausibly, theoretically, interesting question, Niels. we appreciate it.
I guess we'll find out on Star Trek.
I like these questions that are more thought experiments.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for the question.
This podcast is a production of the All Turtles Worldwide Media Empire. We recorded this episode in the world-class Donatello Studios in San Francisco, California. Thanks to Azeem Azhar for joining us this episode. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, send us an email to hello@all-turtles.com. Marie reads every message. Thanks to everyone who made this episode possible, including Jim Metzendorf for editing, Marie McCoy-Thompson for producing, Chris Plug for his audio expertise, Micah Rivera for our artwork, and Matt Ammerman for our theme music. On behalf of Jessica Collier, Phil Libin, and yours truly, John C. Fuentes, and the rest of the All Turtles team, thanks for listening.